Okay. I'm Laura Ellis Royal, and I'm a senior IMC major from Yazoo City, Mississippi. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce to you all founder and curator of MagCulture, Jeremy Leslie.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. And thank you to Samir for inviting me here to speak today. We've known each other for a few years. I think I'm going to mention that later in the talk, but I also just want to thank him for the programming of today, because following as I am, Linda and Daniel from earlier, they've really done the heavy lifting for me. So I can just stand here and show you some nice stuff. Although I hope I'll deliver a little bit more than that. We have some sort of weird technical issue, which means that my slides fade. My logo, so I run MagCulture, and MagCulture has a bright red logo, and that kind of dull thing up at the top right hand is my logo. I'm here to talk about how much I love magazines. Our line around the whole business is "We love magazines." What is that business? My background is a graphic designer. I trained as a designer, and for most of my career I've been an editorial designer, and I'll share some of that work today. There is the online journal, where we publish a lot of reviews and opinions about magazines, in particular the new generation of independent magazines. I recently opened a shop, a retail space in London, which shares the same space as my studio, so the whole businesses are combined there. So those are the three main elements of what we do. And then within that, there's also, I do design consultancy with publishers. I write for other outlets and books and publishers. We run events, and I'll be talking about some of those, and we recently launched a podcast. What holds all these elements together? There we go, it's gone brighter. That's how it should be. See, patience. Well, what holds all these together? Oh, look, it's going dull. What holds all these things together is our line, "We love magazines." And I know I'm kind of speaking to a room full of people. I don't need to talk too much about loving magazines, but that's what we put on our website, on everything we do, business cards. It's what I go around the world talking about, the love for magazines. And it might seem a very easy, almost trite thing to say. As I say, I doubt I'm going to find anyone that's going to put their hand up in this room and say, "Oh, well, I don't." I hope you all do, and I hope by the end of the day you love them even more than ever. But let's just sort of, I'd like to look at those three words that make up the phrase and sort of clarify that in terms of what we do in the broader business. So the we of MagCulture is very, very small. I've worked in big agencies, big publishing companies in very senior positions. I've worked in groups of 300, 400 people. But MagCulture, if you take into account the freelance support and the people that contribute on a part-time basis, there's about, I think, 5.5 of us. So it's a very small entity, it's a small organisation, and I think we punch above our weight in terms of the number of people that are contributing on a day-to-day basis. But as with so many organisations now, the we of MagCulture is much bigger than those 5.5 people. As I fade away again. We are part of a much broader network. It's an international network, and that's what brings me here. That's what my relationship with Samir is. We are part of this same connected group of people. MagCulture is in London, and we kind of represent the kind of London arm of this international network. But there is, as you'll come to see later in my talk, there's a huge network of individuals and small organisations and companies that contribute to a much bigger world and community of which we are a part of. So whilst we're tiny, we're part of a much bigger ecosystem. Love, well, my love for magazines, I mean, the love that MagCulture as an entity has for magazines is born of my love for magazines, and that comes from working for so long, 30 odd years, designing and making them. But when I was studying graphic design at university, I fell in love with magazines because the other design disciplines that we were being exposed to were about making other people's products, designs, entities look good. I wanted to work, and I built a relationship with magazines because I wanted to work with content. I wanted to be as responsible for the content and its presentation as I am for just making a pretty logo. And that love of magazines is born of a fundamental belief I have that graphic design and visual communication was initiated by the first magazines 200 years ago. And that kind of that point at which text and image combine on the page with design to express something really unique and special about the story being told. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my presentation, as I will about magazines themselves. So I do like the way the slide goes brighter as soon as I put the word magazines big on the screen. So magazines, I have a very, very broad outlook on what a magazine can be, and we'll come to that in a minute. What we specialise in at MagCulture is magazines that we choose and select as, in terms of what we're writing about, in terms of what we're selling. We select magazines which we think are great magazines, and it doesn't matter whether they're from the biggest publisher in the world or they're a little zine made by one person in a small little office in the middle of nowhere. We're looking for great, innovative, creative magazines. Right now, I think we're, despite all the problems that we know facing the issue from the business sense, although reassured by the great research and stories that Linda was sharing earlier, we know that there are business challenges for the whole industry, but from an innovation and creative point of view, from that standpoint, this is one of the best eras to be working in magazines, and I will demonstrate that in this talk. What I do not believe, and you know, I'm standing here as a middle-aged guy. I've worked for 30 odd years in the business. My current interest and love of magazines is not born of a nostalgia for when I was younger and when things were when money was flowing through the business like nothing. I strongly believe right now it's a great time to be involved, and I hope I can demonstrate that. But first of all, some nostalgia. This was the magazine that first got me into magazines. When I was at school, this was the weekly magazine, the New Musical Express. I was into rock music, and in particular then it was the punk era in London. And this is the magazine on my way to school on a Thursday morning I would pick up from the kiosk. And the reason I bought that was not because of the great design or any other particular elements. It was because of the content, because of the interviews yet, but because of the record ads, because of the listings. What bands was I going to go and see that week? And the adverts for those bands. And this, of course, was a period. Of course, this is. I think it was 1978. So what's that? 40 years. 40 years. And of course, thank you. Yeah, corrected by Samir. Of course, there was no internet. That goes without saying. But the other thing that's got to be mentioned here at this stage is that this was at a stage when the kind of broader cultural world that we experience online, in any magazine, any TV show now, was not covered in the mainstream press. Rock music was not. This was the only place. It wasn't because there was no internet. This was the only outlet for the music that I was into. So this was an absolute must-have if I wanted to engage with this world. But then sometimes you turn up at the shop on Thursday morning and they'd sold out. There was no New Musical Express, so I had to buy this magazine called Sounds. Now, if I were to put the two of them next to each other, you'd probably think, well, what's the difference? And I have to admit, what is the difference? Visually, there is no difference whatsoever. They're both black and white tabloids with a bit of spot red ink on them, very inky, newsprinty, rough and ready, the technology of the day. But looking back now, I realised that I had to buy the New Musical Express because that was the personality, the character of that magazine, which was born of the editor and the writers and the way they put the magazine together, spoke to me. They were my friends. I got to know the names of the writers, and I would turn to certain sections every week because I wanted to read this person or that person. If I had to buy Sounds, it was like dealing with a vague acquaintance. It wasn't a friend. It had all the same information, all the details were in there. It did the job, but it didn't have the character. And I took a lot from that. I didn't realise it at the time, but that was sort of setting me on my route into magazines. Magazines are like people. They have character, and they reflect the character of everyone involved in the team making them up. I'm going to be sort of jumping around a little bit between various aspects. So that's kind of how I got started. This was the first magazine front cover I ever designed when I was studying. This was a music fanzine, and of course it had to be black and white with a red detail, because that clearly was the language I'd learned. This was where I studied. It wasn't that long ago. That was more than 41 years ago. Well, at 41 when I was at school, so maybe this is like, but this is, so this, that tower block there was my university. It was then called the London College of Printing. And it's now the London College of Communication, of course, because you can't have a College of Printing, because that puts everyone off, apparently. But it was a great university to attend. The reason I've got this black and white image, and then this next one, which is a close-up, really blurry, this was what London was like then. It was very black and white. It was very blurry. It had none of the kind of. I don't know that. When I found this image online, I was just looking around on Google to try and find something that reminded me of my time there. And I was disappointed with this at first. Then I thought, no, that's what it was like. That's exactly what it's like. Because into that world came two magazines. One was this one, which, as you can see, was so bright and colourful and in your face. This was a listings magazine, which was launched while I was studying. It was designed by a great designer called David King, who'd cut his teeth on the Sunday Times magazines. But I just loved the vivacity, the absolute vital nature. It was done on a real budget, but they're really exciting visual covers that even, they owe a lot to early 20th century modernism and futurism, but they really, really just rocked the newsstand, and they really hit a nerve with me. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I was really lucky when I first left university. This was my first magazine job, was working, not obviously designing covers. I was doing the grunt work, but I worked the first summer at this magazine and got the bug. I got the bug for making magazines. This was weekly. So in the space of 2 or 3 days, you'd produce something, and the next day it would be on sale. Fantastic. The other magazine that stirred me was The Face, which was the magazine which kind of took the stuff from the NME and began to move it into the glossy mainstream. No coincidence that Nick Logan, who established the New Musical Express, and at the era I was enjoying it, left there. He did actually go to do another magazine, but he then launched this as his own magazine, and it was the same guy, same personality, same character, and he took a lot of the writers with him. And I really engaged with this magazine because it absolutely had the best art director, the best content, and it was reinventing the frame and the world that I lived in. And again, I was lucky enough. I didn't get to work there, but I worked at a competitor magazine, and this was my first big role in magazine design. That was called Blitz magazine. So I was working in magazines. That was a monthly. That was fine. I learned a lot doing that. But then I moved back into weeklies, and I was a creative director at Time Out magazine, which I hope is a brand you know. Back then, it was a paid-for magazine published weekly, and I was running a studio, so I learned to manage designers, manage teams, hit deadlines, be creative. We did a lot of typographic solutions on the front cover. The main thing here was because it was weekly and it stood on the newsstand, we had to pay for it then. Most editions of the magazine now are handed out free at public transport stations. But the main thing I had to do each week was make it look different enough to the previous week so that people realised there was a new issue out. Because so on Monday, issue X was on sale, and the following morning, the next issue was on sale, so it had to look different. But we played around with typography, and photography. Very proud of some of the front covers I did here. But around this time, I began to realise that magazines did something else other than just kind of tell you about what bands to see or what movies to see. I would travel. I would go on holiday, and wherever I went, I would pick up magazines. And my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, would always say, "Why are you hanging? We're on holiday. Why are you hanging around magazine stores?" But I was collecting magazines, and I realised that there was this international world of magazines, and that almost regardless of the language they were written in, you could understand them and read them as a magazine in its own sense. And I put the collection together into my first book, which was called Issues, which was published in 2000. And the fundamental thinking behind this was that, of course, magazines reflect the world that they were created into. Of course they do in terms of the written content and the coverage, the stories they tell verbally, the stories they tell visually, whether it's in illustration or photography. We take that for granted, I think, and there are great archives. I think later tonight we're going to hear from a esteemed archivist and collector of magazines about the historical context within which magazines exist. And they're great sources of what people thought at a particular time. But I was interested also because they were fantastic vehicles and records of graphic design of their time as well. It might be, graphic design gets, as a designer, I know you get influenced by what you look at, what you see, by new technology. When InDesign came in and introduced the ability to put drop caps at the beginning of capitals in a far easier way and simpler way than Quark Express, the preceding tech of choice, suddenly every magazine had over-the-top drop caps, and all these things mark their time. And I wanted to record these magazines in a book, the looks and the feels of the magazines, the designs, because for most people, of course, and most people engaging with magazines on a day-to-day basis, they are a temporary item, and that's what makes them so exciting. As a designer, you put your whole effort into making the magazine, well, as a designer, as an editor, as a magazine maker, you put your whole effort into making the magazine as great as you can, but then you also know that next week, next month, next quarter, you've got another chance at doing it all over. And you've got to hit deadlines. So you cut corners, and in cutting corners, this kind of unmediated influences come in. And so they act as fantastic records of graphic design as well as verbal and image history. So just quickly, obviously there's 200 pages in this book, but I'll just highlight this one example that was from the magazine Ray Gun, designed by David Carson, a music magazine from the time, and Carson was a very, he's still working, I hope some of you know his work, but he was a very flamboyant designer, and he deemed this interview with the the singer Brian Ferry so boring that he typeset it in Zap Dingbats. So there it is. So that was one example from that book. And then that book was followed up by MagCulture, which was the first use of the name MagCulture. Which was a sort of similar mix of visual content and essays. And the example I have from that was a front cover of a British-style magazine called Sleaze Nation, which was designed to sit on the news racks next to, like one of those T-shirts, next to another magazine saying, pointing out that this is the cool mag and this magazine next to me is stupid. And I love that idea. But that's the sort of thing, people laughed and forgot about it. And if it wasn't recorded in a book, well... We heard about customer magazines or content marketing in the form of magazines earlier. For the whole of the noughties, I worked at a company called John Brown Publishing in London, where we worked for clients of all types. I was a group creative director there. So we worked for, just quickly across the top, we worked for supermarkets, accountancy firms, insurance companies, Virgin and all that, Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Trains, Staff Magazine, for Sappi, paper company. Don't know if Daniel's still here. The post office, the bank, Swarovski Crystal, the government, and Virgin Atlantic. The thing that I'm proudest about with what we were doing then, it's quite common for a publishing company to working across so many different types of magazines, is that you develop a kind of house style. Our house style was that we would adapt to whatever the client wanted and what they were doing. So there are 10 magazines there, and I'm very proud that they all look very different because they had a very different role to achieve. And I just wanted to highlight two particular projects that we were making at the same time around about 2003. These, in a sense, at that time for us as a company, were our two most successful products. On the right-hand side is the magazine for Sky, which is Rupert Murdoch's TV service. Do you have Sky in this country? No, it's Fox. Yeah. But the Sky exists in various territories. So that was a magazine that at the time was the biggest magazine in the UK. It was sent to all Sky subscribers on a monthly basis. They had 7 million subscribers, and we printed 7 million copies every month, and they were mailed out to their people. Therefore, it's a very, very commercial beast, and as you can see, it's celebrity-driven. It's following all the ideals of a mainstream magazine: a celebrity, eye contact, lots of cover lines, numbers, we can warm colours, etc. It's ticking a lot of boxes. That was very successful, both as a commercial product, but I felt very proud of it as a creative product within the confines of what it had to exist. On the left is Carlos magazine, which is a magazine that was produced for Virgin Atlantic, and it was distributed through their upper class cabins, and it was devised as a kind of fanzine. Couldn't be more different to the Sky magazine. I'm going to show you some spreads. It was printed in 1 or 2 colours on a cream-coloured stock. It had a card cover. That brown there is an assimilation of it, but it was actually mottled brown card, stapled. It set its own agenda. So obviously Liv Tyler is in a movie that's being distributed by Sky that month. Carlos just took its own way. It just dealt with its own content, and as I say, it was very much designed to be a fanzine for the regular flyers in the upper class cabin on Virgin Atlantic. So we have a profile of Malcolm McLaren, the iconoclastic man behind the Sex Pistols. It's all illustrated. There's no photography in this magazine. We have a piece about branding, about referencing Coke, where the whole headline and start becomes the kind of graphic opener. A profile of the footballer who was still playing football at the time, Zinedine Zidane, with a portrait. And here you see that. So we switched from these very flamboyant opening spreads to these much more heavier spreads, and we kind of, in our kind of highfalutin way, we were referencing the New Yorker and thinking we were very serious. And but I still remain proud of it visually. We also got approached by a book publishing company, Dorling Kindersley, to reinvent the children's encyclopedia or the family encyclopedia. This is the cover. This is the kind of shows you the kind of scale of it. They came to us and said, "We really like your magazine work. So what would you do if we had you redesign the encyclopedia?" So myself and editor David Roberts came up with this idea for something called Pick Me Up, and the idea was that instead of it being announced as this is what you need to learn, everything you need to learn for school and blah, 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 this was just a big thing telling the kids in the shops when they go in to pick up this thing. And then we just asked questions throughout. It had all the this curriculum material in terms of history and geography and math, but it also dealt with self-image, which is a key thing for this kind of 11 to 15-year-old age group we were aiming at. So we didn't just announce self-image. We asked questions. We were dealing with art history and asking why is the Mona Lisa beautiful, underlying which is the Mona Lisa beautiful, and am I beautiful, and etc. We dealt with history by having standoffs between, in this case, the United States of America versus Superman. You guys won. Well done. But along the way, it was all very serious, but it was great. It was fun. The way in was through fun. And as you can see here, we actually created kind of the superhero version, a model kind of doll. We had board games to teach you not just about what democracy is, but also where it came from in terms of the ancient Greeks. We asked lots of questions. We had some spreads like this where we just asked questions. So this is germane to everything we're talking about today, but imagine a world without printed words and deleted all the words from that image. Obviously, it's a newsstand, but there would have been advertising all across there. There's a road sign, there's the name of the kiosk, there's stuff on the side of the bus. Words have been deleted, and it's just trying to get kids to think about these things. And this is my favourite part of the whole book. This was the story of how we made the book. And it's a double-page spread set in about 6 point. So tiny. I mean, this is a huge blow-up, so it's really hard to read. But the point was, so imagine, how do you make a book? So it's, it all begins before anyone has written a single word, blah, blah, and the page has been sent to an expert on the subject called a consultant, someone who knows almost everything there is. Anyway, so working with David, who's a great editor, but he didn't really get this point at all. So he said, all we have to do, it's fine, Jeremy, don't worry about it. We'll write 300 words and we'll just repeat it until we fill the page. No. Not at all. No, this was going to be the whole story all the way through, and it ends with writing this page. Because those of you who've got kids know the kids are going to sit down. They're going to read every little word. And that's kind of a long-winded way from coming round to the fact that if you're going to, it's about quality again. If you're going to do it, you have to do it. You can't cut corners. You can't. That's when things go wrong. You have to do it to the nth degree and see it through. And then, so I'd done the book MagCulture, and then I downloaded a copy of WordPress, and this was a very early iteration of MagCulture. The site got hacked a few years ago, so I lost the first post. So this is a fake. It's a real layout of what was then a blog as it stood. But anybody who's technically adept will notice that against all the topic list there's lots and lots of things already been published. But this I found through the Wayback Machine. This is the first ever post that was posted. It's about the Grazia magazine. That was on February the 7th, 2006. So 13 and a bit years later, is still publishing lots of material on there, and we'll return to that. But this was one of, I think, probably 3 revelatory moments to me, was the downloading this and finding a voice online was hugely important. The second thing I want to highlight is the Colophon Event, for which I was a co-curator. That's me with my hair at the back on the far right. This is an event about independent publishing. So by this stage, we were acknowledging and understanding there was a whole new world of independent publishing going on. And we were highlighting this. This was held in Luxembourg in Central Europe. This was where I first had the opportunity to meet Dr. Husney, Mr. Magazine. He came and spoke, delivered a very good talk, of course. It was a 3-day event in Luxembourg. We had about 2,000 visitors. We had speakers from across publishing. And this really, alongside the event itself, we had exhibitions. We published a book. It's a good name for a book, isn't it? We Love Magazines. Familiar? And this was about history and about the contemporary. So we looked at the production processes of magazines, and we talked to a number of people from across the world, including Robert Newman, who some of you might know is a very esteemed New York designer now, designing this old house. And we talked to them about how production methods have changed. We looked at magazines that died. So there's the face down there. That's the magazine I showed you earlier. So these are magazines that had come across, for whatever reason, bad times and have been shuttered. But we highlighted why they still mattered. And that's something I feel very strongly, is that most magazines have a limited life. To draw the parallel with people, maybe too far, but you have your time, and then it's time you move on. And so these are magazines that we were heralding for their greatness in their time, but also acknowledging that their time had gone. That interestingly, with the Face, it's just about to relaunch. They've just relaunched it online now. So I don't know how. It's maybe like 20 years after it first closed, but that's coming back, and they're going to be coming back into print this September. And then most recently, I published the book, The Modern Magazine, which was a much more kind of thorough overview of the publishing world, acknowledging independent publishing and how the new magazines were reinventing genres, and I'll have a look at that later. But here we have a car magazine, which is a very different outlook on the approach to automobiles and automotive coverage, cars from Norway. And I wrote an essay about my belief in design and content working together, and design becoming content. We looked at little magazines like the British magazine Little White Lies, the movie magazine with its illustrated covers. We looked at bigger brands. We interviewed the creative director from Elle in the UK about what she was doing. It was at the height of the interest and buzz around Bloomberg Business Week, so we had a big interview with the British art director Richard Turley, and here are some of his covers. And of course, we're looking at digital, and this iPhone apps, which are just beginning to come on. I do think the New Yorker app is a fantastic app. And in the meantime, I was still designing, and we were beginning to do more and more online work. So we designed the identity for Aeon, which is an online publishing platform. We designed the website. Our website, Advanced, this design's been held for now for 3 or 4 years, but this is the MagCulture Journal as it exists. This is a grab from yesterday. And this sums up very much what we're about. And I can't stress this enough. So this is the homepage. Each one's got a story behind it. This is generally a week's content will fill the homepage. So we try and get 6 posts up a week. But what's really, really important is the mix. So we have interviews, we have reviews, we've got our own events. I'll talk more about Mod Mag in a minute. But the key thing is, on this page here, we've got a little tiny kind of, I think they print 300 copies, Terrible People zine. It's a great read. It's a lovely little project. There's that, but then at the top there, we've got the Washington Post, and they're the front covers they published this weekend to mark Earth Day. So there's big, big magazines and little tiny magazines, but what holds them all together is that from an editorial standpoint, where I'm coming from, is that they've got something great to speak about magazines and publishing today. Designing. So this was a little wine magazine that existed like this. It was very illustrated. It was trying to readdress and reinvent the genre of wine publishing. So we redesigned that. They wanted to keep a kind of handwritten, visual, illustrated feel. So these are the covers we came up. We redid the masthead, the logo. So it's still handwritten, but it's a more kind of logo, more of an identity. And the people behind that still publishing the magazine, but they now have their own wine bar. So it's great to see on the window of that, the logo exists as a great big kind of old-fashioned gold leaf type of presentation on the glass window. Published our own magazine, Fiero, which looked at young product designers. We didn't want to make stars of the designers, so we used found numbers to indicate what issue you were looking at. So these are the front covers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these are some of the designs from inside. I'm going to kind of flick through for time. And then I'm also now, I mentioned Luxembourg in relation to Colophon conference. I'm now creative director of a publishing company there, where we work on a number of magazines about local English people, science, architecture, the local listings magazine, City, and a huge brand which deals with finance, which is growing and growing, and we're going to be taking that across into other countries shortly. So I work remotely. I go out there regularly, and I oversee the studio. This was a book called Independence, which was kind of different in that it dealt with interviews with magazine makers. These are the 12 magazines that were featured in the book. They are, again, the new generation of independent magazines. Because of the nature of the project, these all happen to be UK-based, because they're actually based on a series of live interviews that I did in London. But I interviewed the people behind them in great depth, because there's so much interest in this area about how do I go about making my own magazine. And then because we had 12 interviews, we produced 12 front covers. So although the book is the same, each cover is based on a distorted version of the individual magazine. So that's quite a nice solution to coming up with something. So people can pick their own one. It's abstracted, but if you know what you're doing, you know which magazine it represents. And this is the inside. So we dealt with the Gourmand, the food magazine. So really in-depth discussions about how they went about doing it. And I mentioned this book. So I mentioned 3 things. So there was downloading WordPress, there was Colophon, and then the book, The Modern Magazine. Not because of the book per se, but because the way we launched the book. We launched it as with a conference in London. And that was in 2013. And last year we held the 6th edition of that conference, and that's called Mod Mag, as in the contraction of Modern Magazine. So Mod Mag London took place at the Conway Hall, and again, just to emphasise our interest in magazines and what we're doing, we get about 300 people coming along to hear from magazine makers that we mix from London and other countries. So this is Rod Stanley, who's the maker of Good Trouble magazine, a very small, he happens to be a Brit, but he's based in New York. We had the creative director from Elle, so a very big brand, who he's responsible for the British edition, but he had also worked in Paris on the original French weekly edition, and so brought his learnings in terms of how they're dealing with all the new competition from online, etc. We had Elizabeth Crone, who launched her own magazine, which is a feminist magazine. There's a lot of young women making magazines now for young women. This one's particularly interesting because it looks at it through the prism of witchcraft. It's called Sabat. If you can track it down, I can recommend it. It's a beautifully made magazine. It's absolutely as much about the production values of the making of it. And then we closed the day with Emmett Smith, who's the creative director from National Geographic, who flew in from Washington and spoke about how they have invested in a huge redesign project to re-emphasize, having been very successful online, to re-emphasize the value and desires of print, and how they're readdressing their mission to explain the world more through the world of people than the world of geography. And then this is the end result of our first New York edition of ModMag, which took place last year in Manhattan. Similar setup, a whole day of talks, big magazines, small magazines. We're back there this year. Shameless plug, that's why I'm here. tell you to make your way down to New York, where you can hear from the creative director of Glamour about how they've shifted from being in print to solely digital. Fascinating journey. The editor and founder of California Sunday magazine will be coming to talk about both about that project and about Pop-Up magazine, which I'll mention again later in this talk. The creative director of the New Yorker, talking again about digital work. From Europe, the creative director from the Gentlewoman will be coming over to talk about how she takes forward the women's market. Same with the Eye on Design, AIGA's magazine. Perrin Drum will be joining us. Rod from Good Trouble, who spoke in London, is coming to join us. And then Jodie Kwan, who's the amazing photo director from New York Magazine, will be talking. And this, again, is a slide which, for me, sums up what everything that we do is about. Huge, long-standing, historic 50-year-old magazine on the left, a magazine with 2 issues into what it's doing on the right. Both absolutely got a lot to share and talk about. We'll also be having a pop-up version of our shop, and I'm going to dive into our shop in a minute, and I'm conscious that I need to get on for time. We'll have a shop alongside the conference for 3 weeks. We did that last year, and we're returning to that this year. And then, so this is our shop space in London. This was an absolute revelation opening this up. It happened to be an old newsagent, an old news kiosk. It had failed, as is so many of these businesses are failing now. And I thought it's just time for London to have a proper magazine shop. There is, as I keep saying, and I'm going to come to them, a new generation of independent magazines being produced, which absolutely tick all the boxes that Daniel was talking about in terms of the lushness of their production. And I wanted there to be somewhere that solely dealt and presented great magazines in that way. So I took over this derelict space, and I just, we found this beautiful floor underneath. We began to make it smarter and got it done up. And I wanted there to be a big shelf, so we had a big shelf built and we had it installed. It's on wheels, so the studio's behind the shop, so we can adjust, we can make the shop bigger for events by taking up the studio space. And these are the guys putting in the shelves. Launch party, first customer, very happy. And this is the shop now. So it is just MagCulture. It is the MagCulture shop. The same range is available online. Inside, you'll find magazines presented as magazines should be presented. So they're all full face. They're all given the space. These magazines, the people that make these magazines put so much effort into making them. So we put a hell of a lot of effort into presenting them. We made that floor good, and we use that as the basis for our Instagram feed, where we present all the new stock. Photographed on that. And you want to visit, right? So let's visit. Instagram, the website. Jamie was doing the Instagram. As you can see, so you can see all the magazines, and we encourage people to come in and spend time. I'm not sure it's clear from that little clip, but we have some sofa and some chairs. People come in, they will spend an hour looking through all the magazines and then come to the counter with a bundle like that. We do window displays. With various people, including here we have. So later on today at the dinner, I'll be introducing a little video about this unique cover that I Magazine did. But we had them in the window. That's a bunch of the different, some of the covers, a little tease for tonight. And then however much control you have of it all, then someone comes along and does this. I wouldn't mind, but there's some graffiti's kind of cool, but that's just shit. I mean, gee. And the upshot of this, so we've been doing this for just over three and a half years now, and so we're getting known as a spiritual home for the independent magazine scene. And we're not, I mean, as I said at the beginning, MagCulture is part of a much bigger ecosystem, but we're very proud to be a part of that and to have comments made like this. And that's founded on the way we work. So I'm going to show you a bunch of people here. These are people that came into the shop. And I don't know who you think are making the magazines that we sell, but these are people that make their own magazines and came in to show me the magazine and say, would you sell the magazine? And as you can see, they're a mixed bunch. You might think, going back to my original point, probably the guy on the top right is a little older than a lot of them. And you might think a lot of them are kind of people that have been working in the industry for a long time, been doing this, been doing that, and now they're doing their own little magazine because they got fired from their big position at a big company. But no, there are people like that, and there are a lot of people doing really good work, but there are also a lot of young people who are just want to get in and make their own magazine. So we welcome people. We work with third-party distributors for a lot of the magazines, but we also have direct relationship with lots of publishers. And they are very international. Like from memory, I mean, these guys, this couple is from Turkey. I can't remember else. From India. And we hold little events. So we push that shelf back, and we have every month we have an event. So we do the big conference twice a year, once in London, once in New York. Then monthly we have a little event where an individual editor comes and speaks about their magazine. It's annual at the moment, but we do a masterclass in magazines. We did this recently, where people can come along, spend the day hearing from publishers and distributors and printers about how to make your own magazine. The last year we did this for the first time, and there are 5 magazines in existence now because of this masterclass. We do a podcast. This is the new one that's just out today. This is really interesting. I never ever thought I would be interested in doing this, but it's the most fantastic thing, because when you're reviewing and writing for a website, it's very hard not to just be very serious. But when you're talking with someone, and I do this with a fantastic young journalist called Liv Siddall, who also co-hosts the conferences, we have a kind of good working chemistry. We did this because we just had a laugh talking about magazines, and I hope that comes across in the podcast, but it's a very different mood to the kind of review on the journal. So, I'm running out of time. And at last we come to the important part, the magazines. So this is the big shelf in the shop. We stock, at any one time we have at least 500 magazines on the shelves. A lot of them are quarterly or biannual, which means that we will sell out and put another magazine in there. So across a year, we probably stock about 700 different titles. They come from all over the world, literally. We only stock English language magazines, which limits us to some point, but increasingly now the natural language for all these magazines, if you're in the Netherlands and you produce an independent magazine and want to get it out to the world, you're not going to publish it in Dutch. You'll publish it in English. So we have magazines from the whole of Europe, obviously from this country, from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, English-speaking territories. Southeast Asia from colonial days still has a lot of English. And we source these magazines, and increasingly now people just send the magazines to us in the hope we'll sell them. They cover everything. They cover traditional genres. There's a lot of fashion magazines. There's a lot of architecture magazines. There's art magazines, design magazines, women's magazines, children's magazines, travel magazines. There's all things like that. And then there's a lot more creative, interesting magazines that are going beyond the traditional genres. They are made largely by small groups of people, and they are not hobbies, but they are labours of love. They are passion projects. They are not being done as businesses. Some are being done in the hope of becoming businesses, and many do become businesses. And I'm going to talk in a moment about some of them. But it is a really exciting world of publishing that is undervalued and under-recognised, although it's increasingly becoming recognised. They do exactly what Daniel was talking about in terms of being beautifully produced, beautifully presented. I just want to go in quickly along that and talk about the kind of two polar opposites of magazines in terms of my understanding of what a magazine is. This, I hope, is clear from that slightly kind of elongated, blurred image. This is a piece of wood. I forgot to bring it with me, but I do have if I had it, I would knock it on this table here, and it would go bang, bang, bang like two pieces of wood would. But a cantankerous artist has screen printed the words "nice magazine" on the front, and it has a barcode, and it was put on sale as a magazine. It's a magazine without content, and it's part snarky joke, it's part art prank, but for me it's a fantastic signifier of what a magazine is or can be. It's a physical item. It's something which you hold and share and present and move around. That of course, is one extreme of the magazine. That's the vehicle for the magazine. At the other extreme, you have content, and this is a still from a project called Pop-Up Magazine, which is from California. Do you guys know this magazine? No? So this is produced by the same people that do California Sunday. It actually predated that. It goes on tour. It's about to go on tour now. I think it's visiting 10 cities across the United States, where the night of ModMag in New York, that night they'll be in New York. So we're all going to go off and see it. It's a live magazine, and the only way you get to see or experience this magazine is buy a ticket, go and sit in the audience, and you have a series of presentations. There is the spring issue is coming now. I saw it last year. It's the most fantastic live experience. You have 9 different presenters like this, but with accompanying music or film or animation or dancers, or everything is done to make the content come alive. And it really makes you think about what a magazine might be. So in a sense, if you take Nice Magazine, that piece of wood, and you take the content from this and put them together, you perhaps have the ideal magazine. You've got the physicality and you've got the great content. To end, I just wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about these magazines. So these are 5 magazines that have superseded that idea of being a labour of love and become businesses. They absolutely do what we've been hearing earlier about slowing you down, very deliberately taking advantage of print. You won't find listings for bands in any of these magazines because that doesn't exist in print anymore. That goes online, of course. But these magazines, going from the far right, Serial is a travel magazine, very stylish, very monochrome, very modernist. Apartamento is kind of a contemporary world of interiors. It is a magazine that looks at the reality of living and shows how young creative people live in a world where they can't afford to buy their own space, so they're renting. And how creative do they get? They get very creative, and it's a fantastic record of that. The Gourmand is a food magazine. The Gentlewoman is a new type of women's magazine. I just want to focus, though, on delayed gratification, because this, in a way, sums everything up about what we're talking about in terms of slowing things down, enjoying. As I say, people come into the shop and will spend an hour looking through magazines, and you know they're going to take them home and make time, as Stephen was saying last. Is it Stephen last night? Yeah. As he was saying, get comfy in your special seat and a glass of wine and enjoy the magazine. Delayed gratification has been in existence for 7 years. It's a British magazine. It's a news magazine. They launched a news magazine 7 years ago. Twitter existed. All the social media networks weren't as big and as influential as they are now, but they existed. Why would you launch a news magazine? Well, the answer is that, as the name indicates, they very deliberately produce a magazine that looks back 3 months previous and readdresses what was important from the news for that quarter. So the current issue is looking back at the last 3 months of last year, 2018, and it works chronologically through all the news stories, and it digs up what was really important. So we all know that we can get the latest headlines here and now, and it's fantastic to. Well, it's not always fantastic. It's sometimes bloody miserable, but it's great that you can know what's happening so easily across the world. But it's very hard to evaluate how important that news is there and then. This magazine contradicts the idea that print can't handle news by taking advantage of the slowness and using that time that they have gained to look back. And that very much sums up what all these magazines are doing. As a finale, just want to highlight 5 other magazines which are doing stuff that's very, very interesting from a technical and production point of view. These are an international series of magazines that I adore at the moment. We have a shelf in the shop because, as I said, our business is about loving magazines. We Love Magazines appears everywhere. There's a shelf in the shop that says We Love ... These are in there. So starting from the left here, Migrant Journal was launched by a couple of people who had no experience in publishing whatsoever. They wanted to readdress the narrative around immigration and migration. And they looked at their various options. They thought about doing a website, but then they realized that actually they want to do something. They want to do something that's going to last the test of time. This timeless thing again. They want to have something that can be accessed in 20 years' time. And they felt very sure that if they did an online entity or a digital entity, they would have to be working overtime for the next 20 years to make sure it's still accessible online. By moving into print, do I need to? No. Okay. I was so nervous. I thought, oh my God, it's going to come and say, thank you, that's enough now. But yeah, so they moved into print and they made a beautiful print magazine. I don't have time to go into greater detail in terms of, I could, there's lots to show you, but it's beautifully produced in terms of print and paper. And it's a really interesting project that makes the most of print because they think it's going to last. They also, they limited themselves to 6 issues. So the final issue will come out this June. They will have told the story they want to tell and sell. And they will then the project will be completed. It will be in libraries and archives for the future. MacGuffin is one of those magazines that I mentioned that doesn't take a traditional theme or genre of publishing. This one, as it says, this one is about the ball. And so we've got a golf ball and we've got Venus with one of its moons in front of it. So 2 very different globes. The whole magazine just uses the ball as a starting point to deal with sociology, cultural history, art, design, etc. So there's a piece in there about how the mirror ball in discos came to be. There's a piece about soccer balls and how they're made. There's a piece about ball boys and girls who at the tennis and football and other sports have to go and collect the balls that go off the pitches. So it takes one object and tells a million stories around it, and it's the most fantastic kind of mix of different types of content that comes out. The next issue will be coming out soon, and it's about trousers. Civilization is from New York. It's by Richard. It's one of the people behind it is a guy, Richard Turley, who was the creative director I mentioned from Bloomberg Business Week. This is his attempt to do something that will sit. He wants it to sit alongside the New Yorker, New York Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, but for millennials. I've tried to show it's bigger than the others. It's actually broadsheet. It's a really, really absurd, annoying, ridiculous size. It's that broadsheet newspaper size. It's difficult to use. The pages are absolutely full. That cover kind of gives you a sense of it's both historically related to the kind of early alternative press from the 60s and 70s, but it's also hugely contemporary. It's a great read. It's a great visual. It's absolutely doing. I regard him as one of the best designers, art directors working around in publishing at the moment. Very exciting what he's doing there, and it absolutely makes what I believe in terms of design and content melded together into one thing. The Real Review is a lovely architecture magazine that's tall and thin, but it folds out, so it's actually printed as a square magazine, but it's got an extra fold in it, so it folds down to that tall shape, which just means that when you open it, instead of having a double page spread, you have this strange kind of triple fold thing, so it's actually 4 pages at once. And it's fascinating for that. It's great to see both Civilization and Real Review using paper to do something above and beyond the usual kind of A4 standard size. And then Ordinary is a Dutch project, which is, as the name suggests, is as ordinary as possible in many respects. So it is exactly A4 size, European A4 size. It only, on the cover, it always has a blank colour cover, and that colour is always made up of 100% mix of various CMY colours. In this case, it's obviously 100% yellow, 100% cyan to make green. The typeface is Arial, the most ordinary typeface you can get. But the extra bit, the extraordinary bit with the sticker is a bag on the front cover. Every issue there's an object on the cover. In this case, it's the disposable, the plastic straw. They've done a trash bag. They did a washing up sponge. They've done cotton buds. But what they do is then inside is just a series of images, spread after spread of images, and each one's been created by a different photographer or creative, and they take that object and they've used it in a photograph. So some of them are very, very close up, some of them are very distant, some of them are very illustrative, some of them are very realistic. It's just a fantastic kind of storytelling escapade around this one object. There's no written content, it's just visual, but people love it. It's a really, really strong project. So there are 5 very different magazines that sum up what I think is going on in this innovative, creative world of independent publishing. What's interesting now, there's a couple of things just to finish with. There's a lot of these magazines now, they're quarterly or biannual, and the idea of what they're doing is being picked up by the mainstream big publishers. So a lot of the magazines from Condé and Hearst now are looking. British Esquire has just gone bi-monthly, and it's a bigger format, much thicker, lusher paper, etc. And they're absolutely wanting to move into this market, and that presents an interesting question to me. I think we'll probably start stocking it soon. The other thing to note there is, just on a more general level, the other trends that we're seeing content-wise, and this is we've heard lots of really sound arguments about how there's a future for print and the business that we're working in. But the thing that gives me most hope is that the young people I showed you are making the magazines, and they're making magazines about being a woman in the context of Me Too and everything that's been going on. So it's young women making magazines for their compadres. We've had several magazines about mental health, which is a hugely important issue for young people. And we're now getting a series of magazines coming through from men dealing with what it is to be a man in the context of all the women's magazines that are being made about being a woman. And what's fascinating to me is that these are things that concern us in the world, and they concern young people in the world, and they're turning to magazines to express them, and that must surely give us all hope for the future of what we're doing. So I would just end by encouraging you to engage with MagCulture. Come to London or go online and visit the shop, but listen to the podcast, read the journal. If you're in New York on the 29th of May, have a look online. There's a flyer in your bags, in the gift bags, which will tell you a bit more detail about what's happening. We're hosted by the Parsons School of Design, and we do it in collaboration with them and AIGA New York. There'll be the shop. I just want to end because we don't want to forget about the reader. I'm going to finish. This is a favourite cartoon for the New Yorker, and it's the first magazine ever when there was only one person in the world, and that person, of course, was Adam. And the magazine was by Adam, for Adam, about Adam. It's a very funny, it's Ros Chast, of course, it's a very funny magazine. But don't let your magazine be that magazine. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.